During Thanksgiving dinner, my husband's father called me a worthless gold digger, while everyone laughed. Little did they know, I'd been secretly running their family business for the last year, turning their failing $40 million company into a thriving enterprise. Today, at the emergency board meeting they called to save the business, I would finally reveal exactly who's been making all their money. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I never planned to become the invisible CEO of Wilson Manufacturing, and I certainly never imagined I'd be sitting silently at a Thanksgiving table while my husband's family tore apart my character, my background, and my worth. But life has a way of creating perfect storms that reveal people's true colors, and today, the forecast called for a hurricane of truth. The Wilson family had a certain reputation in Chicago. Third-generation furniture manufacturers who'd built their business from a small workshop into a regional powerhouse. Their colonial-style mansion in Lake Forest stood as testament to their success. All mahogany panels and crystal chandeliers, old money trying desperately to look older. My husband Daniel had been groomed since birth to eventually take over from his father Richard, though at 35, he was still waiting for his chance to prove himself. I met Daniel at a charity gala 3 years ago. I'd been working as a business consultant specializing in manufacturing efficiency. Not the most glamorous job, but one I excelled at after earning my MBA and spending years helping companies streamline their operations. Daniel was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my ideas about business modernization. Unlike most men I'd dated, he actually listened when I talked about supply chain management and digital transformation. When he proposed after a year of dating, I thought I'd found someone who valued me for my mind as much as anything else. His family, however, had different ideas. Amanda comes from different circumstances, Patricia, my mother-in-law, would say with a tight smile whenever introducing me to their friends. It was true. I'd grown up in a working-class neighborhood in Detroit, my father a factory worker, my mother a school secretary. I'd worked my way through college on scholarships and part-time jobs. In the Wilsons' world, this made me practically destitute. My father-in-law Richard was less subtle. Daniel always had a thing for exotic pets, he once remarked, after too many scotches looking directly at me. I'm half Filipino on my mother's side, something the Wilsons found endlessly fascinating and slightly concerning. Still, I loved Daniel, and I tried to build relationships with his family. I offered to help with the business when I noticed concerning trends in their quarterly reports that Daniel would bring home. Sales were declining, their manufacturing processes were outdated, and their competitors were eating into their market share. But Richard would wave away my concerns. Amanda, dear, why don't you focus on redecorating the sunroom? Business matters are for the Wilson men to handle. I might have continued in this limbo of polite dismissal if not for what happened last Christmas. Daniel had been stressed for weeks, drinking more than usual, disappearing into his home office, for hours. When I finally pressed him, he broke down. The company's in trouble, Amanda. Dad's been making bad decisions for years. We're on the verge of bankruptcy, but he won't listen to anyone. The board is getting concerned, but they're all his golf buddies, so they won't actually challenge him. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion. 40 years of Wilson Manufacturing might end on my watch, and I don't know how to stop it. That night, as Daniel finally slept, I dug into the company financials he'd left scattered across his desk. The situation was worse than he'd described. They were hemorrhaging money, their product line was outdated, and their manufacturing costs were nearly double their competitors. But I also saw the potential. Their brand still carried weight. They owned valuable manufacturing facilities, and with the right leadership, they could pivot to meet changing market demands. The next morning, I approached Daniel with a proposal. Let me help, behind the scenes. Your father will never accept my input directly, but you can present my ideas as your own. We can turn this around together." Daniel was hesitant at first, worried about deceiving his father, but desperate enough to try anything. Dad's pride is the biggest obstacle. If he knew someone else was calling the shots, especially you, he'd burn the company down himself. So our arrangement began. Daniel became the face of a dramatic company turnaround. I created comprehensive plans to modernize their manufacturing, developed new product lines that appealed to younger demographics while maintaining their quality craftsmanship reputation, and identified inefficiencies that were draining their resources. Daniel would present these ideas in board meetings as his own, and slowly, the company began to recover. Within 6 months, Wilson Manufacturing was showing signs of life. Within 9 months, they were profitable again. By the 1-year mark, they had launched a successful new furniture line that had waiting lists at major retailers. Daniel was being hailed as a visionary by industry publications. The board was thrilled, and Richard was begrudgingly proud of his son's apparent business acumen. Only Daniel and I knew the truth, that every strategy, every innovation, every success had come from the woman they considered only fit for planning dinner parties. Daniel promised that once the company was stable, he would reveal my role and ensure I received proper credit and compensation. I trusted him, perhaps naively. Which brings us to this Thanksgiving. The Wilsons' annual holiday gathering was always an elaborate affair, with extended family and close business associates filling their sprawling dining room. This year had special significance. It was a celebration of the company's remarkable turnaround. Patricia had outdone herself with the decorations, fall foliage arrangements on every surface, hand-calligraphed place cards, the family's heirloom china gleaming under soft chandelier light. I'd offered to help with preparations, but was politely shuffled aside. "Don't worry your pretty head, Amanda. This is what I do," Patricia had said with her characteristic dismissive sweetness. The dinner conversation centered almost exclusively on the business, the successful new product launches, the improved profit margins, the glowing industry reviews. Richard, loosened by several glasses of expensive Cabernet, was in a particularly expansive mood. "I always knew Daniel had it in him," he boasted, clapping my husband on the shoulder. "Wilson blood runs true. When things got tough, that business instinct kicked in." I smiled tightly, pushing food around my plate as Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside me. We'd agreed that the family gathering wasn't the right place for revelations, but each compliment directed at him felt like a small betrayal. Megan, Daniel's sister, raised her glass. "To my brilliant brother. I'll admit, I had my doubts when Dad made you COO, but you've proven everyone wrong." "Here's the thing about the Wilsons," Richard continued, warming to his favorite subject, himself. "We've got business in our DNA. My father built this company with his bare hands. I expanded it across 3 states, and now Daniel has modernized it for a new generation. That's the legacy of strong men making bold decisions." I couldn't help but myself. "The new manufacturing system is particularly impressive," I remarked, having designed it myself. "The efficiency gains alone have saved millions." The table fell quiet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Richard stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking in tongues. "Amanda, I didn't realize you had such interest in industrial manufacturing processes." Before I could respond, Patricia jumped in. "Amanda's been watching one of those business shows on Netflix. What was it called, dear? The one with the entrepreneurs?" "Actually, I worked in business consulting before," I began. "Let's not bore everyone with that," Richard interrupted. "The point is, the Wilson men have pulled off another miracle. That's worth celebrating." I felt Daniel's hand squeeze my knee under the table, a silent plea for patience. We'd agreed to have a proper conversation with his parents after the holidays. Just a few more weeks of this charade. Richard raised his glass again. To Daniel, the son I always knew would make me proud. You've proven yourself worthy of the Wilson name. That's when Richard's brother, Uncle James, decidedly drunker than the rest, chimed in. Now if only he'd picked a wife worthy of it too. The table fell silent. Even Richard looked uncomfortable. Daniel stiffened beside me. James, Patricia warned, but he was too far gone to read the room. What? We're all thinking it. Daniel could have married anyone. Caroline Prescott was certainly interested, and her family owns half of Michigan Avenue. Instead, he brings home this. He waved his hand vaguely in my direction. This fortune hunter from God knows where. That's enough, Daniel said sharply, but his uncle was on a roll. Look around this table, James continued. Generations of success. Real American success. And what does she bring to the table? A pretty face and expensive tastes, just waiting for her piece of the Wilson pie. I sat frozen, feeling every eye on me. This wasn't the first time I'd heard these sentiments, but it was the first time they'd been stated so baldly, in front of everyone. I expected Daniel to defend me forcefully, to reveal even a fraction of what I'd contributed. Instead, he said weakly, Amanda's much more than that, Uncle James. She's been very supportive. Supportive, like I was a particularly comfortable pair of shoes. Richard, perhaps feeling he needed to regain control of his table, added what he probably thought was a defense. Amanda has other qualities. She's organized an excellent Christmas gala for our clients, and she's redecorated Daniel's house beautifully. Exactly, Uncle James slurred. A pretty ornament. That's all these gold diggers ever are. Worthless when it comes to anything that actually matters. I'm sitting right here, I said quietly. Oh, she speaks, James laughed. Did I hurt your feelings, dear? Don't worry. As long as you keep Daniel happy, I'm sure your credit cards will keep working. I looked around the table. Patricia was studying her plate with intense focus. Megan looked uncomfortable but remained silent. Various cousins and business associates stared at their wine glasses. No one, not one person, spoke up. And Daniel, my husband who knew exactly what I had done for his family's company? He placed his hand over mine and said, Let's not ruin Thanksgiving with this talk. Uncle James has had too much to drink. Not, my wife saved your livelihood. Not, Amanda is the reason we're celebrating instead of declaring bankruptcy. Just a plea to change the subject, to keep the peace, to continue the lie. Something inside me hardened in that moment. A decision crystallized with perfect clarity. I excused myself to the bathroom, locked the door, and pulled out my phone. With steady hands, I composed an email to the Wilson Manufacturing Board of Directors, requesting an emergency meeting the following morning. As Chief Operating Officer, Daniel had given me his login credentials months ago to make our arrangement easier, a decision he would soon regret. I added a single line to the meeting agenda. Discussion of company leadership and organizational structure. Then I splashed cold water on my face, reapplied my lipstick, and returned to the table with a placid smile. Who wants pumpkin pie? I asked sweetly. The next morning, I dressed with particular care. A charcoal gray suit I'd purchased for my last consulting job interview, simple pearl earrings, hair pulled back in a sleek bun. Professional. Formidable. Nothing like the ornament the Wilsons believed they had welcomed into their family. Daniel was confused by the early morning board meeting notification. Did you know about this? He asked, adjusting his tie in the mirror. I think your father might be planning something, I said, which wasn't technically a lie. Richard would certainly try to plan something once he heard what I had to say. I think you should prepare for some surprising announcements. The Wilson Manufacturing headquarters occupied a renovated warehouse in Chicago's West Loop, my idea. part of repositioning their brand as both heritage and forward-thinking. The boardroom was on the top floor, with exposed brick walls, original timber beams, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. I had chosen every detail of the renovation, down to the reclaimed wood conference table that came from one of their original factories. When Daniel and I arrived, the board members were already seated, Richard at the head of the table, of course, flanked by his most loyal supporters. 8 men and 2 women, most of whom had known Richard for decades. Lisa Johnson, the company's chief financial officer, was the only one who smiled at me as I entered. She had been my ally behind the scenes, one of the few who suspected the truth about the company's turnaround. "What's she doing here?" Richard frowned as I took a seat at the table, rather than against the wall where spouses sometimes observed. "This is a closed board meeting." "Actually," I said calmly, placing my portfolio on the table, "I called this meeting." The confusion was immediate. Board members exchanged glances. Richard's face flushed red. Daniel looked at me with dawning comprehension and alarm. "That's not possible," Richard said dismissively. "You don't have the authority." "Using the COO's access credentials, I do." I opened my portfolio and began distributing folders to each board member. Inside, you'll find documentation of every strategic decision, product innovation, and operational improvement made at Wilson Manufacturing over the past 12 months. I stood, finding my confidence, growing with each word. You'll notice that each document contains 2 sets of notes. The presentation version, written in a style that matches Daniel's previous communications, and the original drafts, written in my own words, with timestamps and electronic signatures that can be verified. The board members began flipping through the materials, expressions ranging from confusion to shock. "What is the meaning of this?" Richard demanded, though I could see in his eyes that he was beginning to understand. "The meaning, Mr. Wilson, is that your company was on the brink of bankruptcy last Christmas. Your outdated methods and refusal to adapt to changing markets had driven Wilson Manufacturing to the edge of collapse. When Daniel came to you with new ideas, they weren't his." I looked directly at Richard. They were mine. Every proposal presented to this board for the past year, the manufacturing modernization, the new sustainable product line, the direct-to-consumer digital strategy, all of it came from the woman you consider worthless when it comes to anything that actually matters. The room fell silent. Daniel had gone pale. "This is absurd," Richard finally sputtered. "Daniel, tell them this is nonsense." All eyes turned to my husband, whose expression showed a complex mix of emotions: shame, fear, anger. For a moment, I thought he might deny everything, preserve his newfound status as the company savior. Instead, he cleared his throat and said quietly, "It's true. Amanda created the strategies. I presented them as my own because—" He looked at his father. "Because I knew you would never accept them coming from her." Richard looked as though he'd been slapped. "You let your wife run my company, behind my back?" "Your company?" I interjected. "The company that was losing $2 million per quarter under your leadership? The company that now has a waiting list for its products and has increased shareholder value by 60% under my guidance? That company?" Lisa Johnson, the CFO, spoke up. "I can verify these claims. I've worked directly with Amanda on the financial projections for each of these initiatives. The board should know that without her intervention, we would likely be in receivership by now." Board members were now studying the documents with greater interest, whispering among themselves. I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, weighing decades of loyalty to Richard against the undeniable financial results I had delivered. "This is outrageous!" Richard stood, his face mottled with rage. "I won't stand for this ambush. Daniel, we're leaving." "Actually, Richard," said Margaret Chen, one of the newer board members, "I think we need to hear more. These results speak for themselves. If Amanda has been the architect of our recovery, the board has a fiduciary duty to understand exactly what's been happening. Richard looked around the table, suddenly realizing he was losing control of the room, of his company. This is my family's business. 3 generations of Wilsons built this company, and 1 generation nearly destroyed it, I said evenly. I have no interest in taking your name off the building, Richard, but I will no longer be the ghost in the machine. If Wilson Manufacturing is to continue its recovery and growth, it will be with me officially recognized and empowered as Chief Strategy Officer. I turned to the board. You have a choice to make. Continue with leadership that has proven itself adaptable and effective, or revert to methods that nearly bankrupted this company. I've included my formal proposal on page 12. The next 2 hours were among the most tense of my life. Richard threatened, cajoled, reminded everyone of old favors and long friendships. Daniel sat mostly silent, occasionally confirming details when directly questioned. I presented my case methodically, letting the results speak for themselves. In the end, the board voted 8-4 to appoint me as the official Chief Strategy Officer of Wilson Manufacturing, with authority equal to Daniel's COO position. Richard retained his title as CEO, but with significantly reduced operational control. It was a compromise that allowed the Wilson name to remain prominently at the helm, while acknowledging the reality of who was actually steering the ship. As the boardroom emptied, Richard stopped beside my chair. His voice was low, meant only for me. You may have fooled them, but I know what you really are. A manipulative opportunist who married my son to get her hands on what the Wilsons built. I met his gaze steadily. What I am, Richard, is the person who saved your legacy when you were too proud to save it yourself. You might want to remember that at the next family Thanksgiving. The following weeks were a tense transition. Daniel and I had many difficult conversations about trust, honesty, and his failure to stand up for me. Our marriage hung by a thread as we navigated the new reality of being professional equals in the family business, while trying to determine if we still had a personal relationship worth saving. Patricia avoided me entirely, canceling our usual lunches and charity committee meetings. Megan, surprisingly, reached out with a cautious olive branch. I always knew you were smart, she told me over coffee, but I had no idea just how smart. Dad will never admit it, but what you did was impressive. The company continued to thrive under the new leadership structure. With my role officially acknowledged, I could implement changes more efficiently, without the charade of filtering everything through Daniel. Employee morale improved as our more progressive management style replaced Richard's autocratic approach. 3 months after the boardroom revelation, Lisa Johnson and I launched a mentorship program specifically focused on bringing more women into leadership positions in manufacturing. Richard called it social engineering nonsense. When the program reduced our middle management turnover by 40% and improved production team communication, he grudgingly stopped complaining publicly. The most satisfying moment came 6 months later, when Forbes published a feature article on Wilson Manufacturing's remarkable turnaround, prominently featuring my role as the strategic mind behind their renaissance. The photographer insisted on a photo of me sitting at the head of the conference table, with the Wilson family portrait visible on the wall behind me. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but it was deeply satisfying. Daniel and I eventually found our way back to each other, though our relationship was fundamentally changed. He admitted his failure of courage and worked to prove himself worthy of trust again. I learned to be more direct about my needs and boundaries. We would never return to the dynamic of our early marriage, but perhaps we were building something more honest in its place. As the next Thanksgiving approached, Patricia called to discuss the annual family dinner. Richard and I would be pleased if you and Daniel would join us, she said stiffly. Will Uncle James be there? I asked. A pause. We felt it might be Better if James celebrated elsewhere this year. I smiled to myself. In that case, we'd be happy to attend. Would you like me to bring anything? Another pause. Actually, Amanda, I was wondering if you might share your perspective on the table arrangements. You always have such a good eye for these things. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a direct acknowledgement of how they had treated me. But from Patricia Wilson, it was practically a coronation. I'd be happy to help, Patricia, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. And perhaps afterward we could discuss the family foundation's investment strategy. I have some thoughts on how we might improve the returns. A longer pause. Then, with the faintest hint of respect in her voice, she said, I think that would be appropriate. We still had a long way to go, the Wilsons and I. One dramatic boardroom scene couldn't undo generations of entrenched attitudes. But as I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel when this all began. Not just satisfaction at proving my worth, but hope that perhaps the family I had married into could actually become the family I belonged to. The business I had saved turned out to be more than just a company. It was the beginning of a transformation, not just for Wilson Manufacturing, but for the Wilson family itself. And that was worth more than $40 million could ever buy. 6 months after that fateful board meeting, I stood in my new office on the top floor of Wilson Manufacturing headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Chicago's skyline, the morning sun glinting off glass and steel. The space had previously been a storage room for Richard's golf trophies and industry awards, a shrine to past glory. Now it housed the Strategic Operations Center for the company's future. The transition hadn't been easy. Each day brought new challenges, not just in business but in navigating the complex family dynamics I'd upended. The Wilson family legacy loomed large over every decision, every meeting, every company email. Richard maintained his title as CEO, but his role had become largely ceremonial, a fact he reminded me of with every passive-aggressive comment and undermining suggestion. My new assistant knocked gently on the open door. The marketing team is ready for you in conference room B, she said. I gathered my notes on the new spring catalog launch. The Heritage Reimagined collection had been my brainchild, taking classic Wilson designs and updating them for modern consumers, honoring tradition while embracing innovation. A metaphor, perhaps, for what I was trying to accomplish with the company as a whole. As I walked through the executive floor, I caught snippets of hushed conversations that stopped abruptly as I passed. Despite my official title and the board's backing, I remained an outsider to many. The interloper who had seized power, the daughter-in-law who hadn't stayed in her lane. The old guard remained fiercely loyal to Richard, viewing my ascension as a betrayal rather than a rescue. I'd anticipated this resistance and developed strategies to address it. Each department now had performance metrics tied to quarterly bonuses. Results spoke louder than resentment, and gradually, the whispers were giving way to reluctant respect as profits continued to climb. Daniel had settled into an uncomfortable middle ground between his father and me. In public, he supported my initiatives and acknowledged my contributions. In private, our relationship remained strained. He felt humiliated by the board meeting revelation, though he never quite admitted whether his humiliation stemmed from being exposed for taking credit for my work or from needing my help in the first place. I should have stood up for you at Thanksgiving, he'd said one night, weeks after the confrontation. When Uncle James said those things, when everyone just sat there. Yes, you should have, I'd replied simply. I've never seen my father so angry as he was after that board meeting, Daniel continued. He keeps saying you orchestrated a coup. I orchestrated a rescue, I corrected. There's a difference. Daniel sighed, running his hands through his hair. Can you understand how difficult this position is for me? Caught between my wife and my family, the business I was raised to eventually lead. I looked at my husband then, really looked at him. His handsome face was etched with new lines of stress. The confident, charming man I'd married seemed diminished somehow. Had he always been this dependent on his father's approval, or had I simply been too in love to notice? "The position you're in is largely of your own making," I said, more gently than I felt. "You knew what your father thought of me. You knew what I was contributing. You chose the path of least resistance rather than the path of honesty." "I was trying to save the company." "You were trying to be the hero of the story," I interrupted. "Without doing the hard work or taking the real risks. You wanted to be seen as the brilliant son who saved the Wilson legacy, when in reality, you weren't brave enough to tell your father that his methods were outdated and his leadership was failing." The truth hung between us, sharp-edged and unavoidable. Our marriage had been built on mutual respect and attraction, but beneath that foundation lurked assumptions neither of us had examined. Daniel had expected a wife who would enhance his position without challenging the family hierarchy. I had expected a partner who valued my contribution enough to acknowledge it, even when uncomfortable. "I do love you, Amanda," he said finally. "That's always been true." "I believe you," I replied, "but I'm no longer sure that's enough." We were trying couples therapy, neutral ground where we could unpack the complicated tangle of personal betrayal and professional respect. Progress was slow, measured in small moments of genuine communication rather than grand reconciliations. Some weeks I felt hopeful. Others, I wondered if we were just prolonging the inevitable. The marketing meeting went well, the team enthusiastic about the direction for the new collection. Lisa Johnson, our CFO and my strongest ally in the executive team, caught up with me afterward in the hallway. "The Q1 projections are looking even better than expected," she said, falling into step beside me. "The direct-to-designer program you implemented has increased our profit margins by 22% in those channels." "Good. We'll need those numbers for the board meeting next week." Richard had insisted on monthly board meetings instead of the usual quarterly schedule, ostensibly for closer financial oversight, but really to create opportunities to challenge my leadership. Lisa lowered her voice. "Richard's been meeting with Edward Blackwell." I stopped walking. Blackwell Industries was our largest competitor, a multinational furniture conglomerate known for aggressive acquisitions and cost-cutting measures. "You're sure?" Lisa nodded. 3 meetings in the past 2 weeks. My brother works in commercial real estate. He saw them at the Capitol Club. Said they weren't exactly being discreet. A cold knot formed in my stomach. He wouldn't sell. This company is the Wilson legacy, his father's legacy. "Maybe he's decided you've already destroyed that legacy," Lisa suggested carefully. "Maybe selling to Blackwell is his way of preventing you from having control." The thought was so petty, so destructive, and so perfectly aligned with Richard's wounded pride that I knew immediately it was a genuine possibility. Richard would rather burn down 3 generations of family history than see it thrive under my guidance. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "Keep this between us for now, and see if your brother can find out anything else about those meetings." Back in my office, I pulled up our shareholder agreement on my computer. As a privately held company, Wilson Manufacturing had a complex ownership structure. Richard held 40% of the shares, Daniel 15%, various family members another 20%, and the remaining 25% was distributed among the board members and a small group of private investors. Richard couldn't sell the company without board approval, but he could potentially sell his personal shares to Blackwell, creating a dangerous power block. I spent the afternoon making calls to board members, taking their temperature on the company's direction, subtly probing for any hints that Richard had approached them about a potential sale. Most seemed genuinely pleased with our performance, though a few of Richard's old golf buddies were non-committal. That evening, I raised the issue with Daniel over dinner in our downtown condo. His reaction told me everything, the flicker of guilt in his eyes before he masked it with confusion. "You knew," I said flatly. "You knew your father was meeting with Blackwell." Daniel set down his fork. "He mentioned he'd run into Edward at the club. I didn't think anything of it." "Don't lie to me, Daniel. Not again." My voice was steady, but inside I felt a familiar anger rising. "Your father is trying to sell his shares to our biggest competitor, and you didn't think that was worth mentioning to your wife? To the company's chief strategy officer?" He had the decency to look ashamed. "He's not serious about selling. He's just exploring options." Options for what? Undermining the company's recovery? Sabotaging my position? Getting revenge because his pride was hurt? It's more complicated than that, Amanda. This company has been in his control for 30 years. His father handed it to him directly, and now suddenly he's being sidelined by the woman who saved it from bankruptcy, I finished. "I didn't force my way into this position, Daniel. I earned it by doing the work that neither you nor your father was willing or able to do." Daniel pushed his plate away. "What do you want me to say? That my father is being petty and vindictive? Fine, he is. That doesn't change the fact that he's still the majority shareholder." I studied my husband's face, searching for the man I'd fallen in love with. "Whose side are you on, Daniel? Really?" He didn't answer immediately, which was an answer in itself. "I don't think there should be sides. We're supposed to be a family." Families don't undermine each other's life's work. Families don't sit silently while one member is called worthless. Families protect each other. I stood up, no longer hungry. At least, that's what I always thought families were supposed to do. The Wilsons seemed to have a different definition. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in our home office, surrounded by reports and legal documents, searching for a way to protect both my position and the company I'd come to care about deeply. It wasn't just about winning anymore or proving my worth. Wilson Manufacturing employed over 400 people across 3 states. Our suppliers, distributors, and retail partners depended on our stability. A hostile takeover by Blackwell would likely result in massive layoffs and the dismantling of the quality standards I'd worked so hard to maintain. By dawn, I had the outline of a plan. It was aggressive, potentially explosive, and would either secure my position permanently or end my marriage and career at Wilson Manufacturing in one decisive blow. The stakes couldn't be higher, but then they had been high from the moment I'd decided to expose the truth in that boardroom. I spent the next week gathering allies and information. Lisa proved invaluable, using her financial expertise to help structure my proposal. I contacted Margaret Chen, the board member who had supported me during the initial confrontation, and arranged a private lunch to discuss the company's future. "Richard is definitely looking to sell his shares," she confirmed, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "He approached me last week to gauge my interest in selling mine as well. Said Blackwell was offering a premium." "Did you consider it?" I asked directly. Margaret smiled slightly. "I've been on this board for 5 years, Amanda. In that time, the only significant growth we've seen has been under your leadership. Why would I cash out just when things are getting interesting?" With Margaret's support, I approached other board members individually, building a coalition based on financial reality rather than family loyalty. By the time the monthly board meeting arrived, I had commitments from enough members to block any attempt to remove me from my position. But Richard still had the freedom to sell his personal shares. The board meeting began with the usual formalities. Richard sat at the head of the table, a position he insisted on maintaining despite his diminished role. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his bespoke suit a subtle reminder of the wealth and privilege he'd enjoyed his entire life. Daniel sat to his right, looking uncomfortable as always, caught between loyalty and pragmatism. After the standard reports on sales figures and production metrics, all showing continued improvement under my leadership, Richard cleared his throat. "Before we move on, I'd like to discuss a significant opportunity that's been presented to me, he announced. Edward Blackwell has expressed interest in acquiring a substantial position in Wilson Manufacturing. He's offering a 30% premium on current valuation for my shares, and he's extended the same offer to all shareholders. A murmur ran through the room. Even those I'd spoken to seemed tempted by the premium offer. Money had a way of making principles flexible. I've invited Edward to join us today to outline his vision for the company's future, Richard continued, nodding to his assistant who opened the boardroom door. Edward Blackwell strode in, the very picture of corporate confidence in his tailored navy suit. I'd met him at industry events, a shark in an ocean of smaller fish, known for identifying vulnerable companies and systematically absorbing them into his conglomerate. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, Blackwell began, his deep voice projecting easy authority. Blackwell Industries has long admired the Wilson manufacturing heritage and craftsmanship. Our vision is to preserve that legacy while providing the resources of a global organization. It was a practiced pitch designed to reassure board members while glossing over the reality of what an acquisition would mean. I'd seen Blackwell's pattern before: buy a respected brand, maintain the name, but gradually strip away the quality and craftsmanship in favor of mass production and higher margins. Within 5 years, Wilson Manufacturing would exist in name, only its employees scattered, its standards compromised. When Blackwell finished his presentation, Richard looked around the table with barely concealed triumph. I believe this represents the best path forward for all shareholders. Edward has generously agreed to maintain the Wilson name and to consider keeping current management in place during the transition. Consider. The condescension in that single word was breathtaking. I caught Daniel's eye across the table, searching for any sign that he understood what was happening, that he recognized his father's vindictiveness for what it was. His expression remained carefully neutral. Thank you, Mr. Blackwell, for that presentation, I said, my voice calm despite the anger simmering beneath. Before we continue this discussion, I'd like to present an alternative for the board's consideration. Richard frowned. This isn't on the agenda, Amanda. I believe the future of the company is always on the agenda, Richard. I nodded to Lisa, who distributed folders to each board member. Inside, you'll find my formal offer to purchase Richard's shares in Wilson Manufacturing at a 35% premium over current valuation. The room fell silent. Richard's face flushed dark red. This is absurd. You don't have that kind of capital. Actually, I do, I replied. Through a combination of personal funds, investor backing, and a financing arrangement with First Chicago Capital. The details are all there in Section 3. The truth was, I'd leveraged everything I had: my savings, my consulting businesses, client list, even my parents' retirement fund, which they'd insisted on contributing when I'd called them for advice. The consortium of investors I'd assembled included former clients who believed in my business acumen and several women-led investment groups looking to support female executives in manufacturing leadership. Furthermore, I continued, I'm offering the same premium to any other shareholders who wish to sell, with the condition that those who stay will receive a 10% increase in their annual dividends for the next 5 years. It was a bold move, rewarding loyalty while providing a lucrative exit for those who preferred to cash out. More importantly, it gave the board a clear alternative to Blackwell's corporate assimilation. This is a family company, Richard sputtered. It's meant to stay in the Wilson family. I met his gaze directly. I am family, Richard, whether you've ever truly accepted that or not. I'm also the person who turned this company around when it was failing under family leadership. The board has a fiduciary duty to consider what's best for the company's future, not just what maintains your control. Edward Blackwell, ever the opportunist, spoke up. I'm prepared to raise my offer to match Mrs. Wilson's premium. The difference, I countered, is that under my leadership, Wilson Manufacturing will remain independent. We'll maintain our commitment to quality craftsmanship, to our employees, and to sustainable American manufacturing. Under Blackwell Industries, those commitments are far less certain. I turn to face the board members directly. This isn't just about share price. It's about what Wilson Manufacturing represents to our employees, to our customers, and to the communities where we operate. I've included projections for the next 5 years under my continued leadership. The growth potential is substantial, particularly with the European expansion we've begun planning. Margaret Chen spoke first. I appreciate Mr. Blackwell's interest, but I've seen what Amanda has accomplished in just 6 months at the helm. I'm inclined to support her offer, or better yet, to keep my shares and benefit from the projected growth. One by one, other board members voiced similar sentiments. The 35% premium was attractive, but the promise of continued growth under proven leadership was more compelling for many. Richard's supporters argued for tradition and family control, but the financial reality was difficult to ignore. Throughout the discussion, Daniel remained silent, his expression unreadable. As the debate continued, all eyes eventually turned to him. As a board member and significant shareholder himself, his position could tip the balance. "Daniel," Richard said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used throughout his son's life. "It's time to stand with your family. This company has been in Wilson hands for 3 generations. Your grandfather would be appalled to see it controlled by the person who saved it," Daniel interrupted, surprising everyone, including me. "Dad, I love you, and I respect what you and Grandpa built. But Amanda is right. When the company was in trouble, she stepped in with solutions while we were still arguing about whether there was a problem." He turned to face me, something resolute in his expression that I hadn't seen before. "I haven't been the husband or partner you deserved. I let my father's expectations and my own insecurities cloud my judgment. But I see clearly now." He addressed the board. "I'm keeping my shares and supporting Amanda's leadership, not because she's my wife, but because she's proven herself to be the best person for the job." Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is betrayal, pure and simple. My own son, my own board turning against me." "No one is turning against you, Richard," I said quietly. "We're choosing to move forward rather than backward. The Wilson legacy deserves to continue evolving, not to be sold off because of personal grudges." The vote was called. By a margin of 10-2, the board rejected Blackwell's offer and approved my purchase of Richard's shares. The 2 dissenting votes came from Richard himself and his most loyal board ally, his childhood friend Thomas. Edward Blackwell left with a terse handshake and a promise to keep an eye on Wilson Manufacturing's progress, a thinly veiled suggestion that he'd be waiting if we faltered. Richard didn't shake anyone's hand. He simply gathered his papers, gave Daniel a look of profound disappointment, and walked out of the boardroom. The Wilson dynasty had officially changed hands, and for the first time in its history, the company would be led by someone who hadn't been born into the family name. The aftermath was predictably messy. Richard refused to speak to either Daniel or me, communicating only through his lawyers as we finalized the share purchase. Patricia called Daniel in tears, claiming I had stolen their birthright and manipulated everyone to get my way. Megan, surprisingly, reached out to have coffee and hear my vision for the company's future. "Dad will never forgive you," she said bluntly, stirring her latte. "He sees this as the ultimate humiliation." "I understand that," I replied. "But this wasn't about humiliating Richard. It was about preserving what 3 generations of Wilsons built, rather than letting it be dismantled by Blackwell." She studied me thoughtfully. "You know, when Daniel first brought you home, I thought you were after his money. The working class girl who'd landed a wealthy husband. Dad encouraged that perception." She smiled slightly. "I've never been happier to be wrong. If anyone was going to take over the family business, I'm glad it's someone who actually cares about it. You're a Wilson, too, I pointed out. You could have been more involved in the company. Megan laughed. God, no. Dad made it clear from day one that the business was Daniel's inheritance, not mine. I was supposed to marry well and serve on charity boards like Mom. Besides, she added with a hint of mischief, I'm a better artist than businesswoman. Though if you're ever looking to revamp the creative department, I found myself smiling back. Actually, our current creative director is retiring next year. Send me your portfolio. No promises, but I believe in keeping talented Wilsons involved. The real surprise came from Daniel. The morning after the board meeting, he moved his things into the guest room without being asked. I think we need space to figure out if there's anything left between us beyond the business, he said. I've failed you as a husband, Amanda. I see that now, but I'd like the chance to earn back your trust, if you're willing. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in months. No defensiveness, no excuses, just acknowledgement of the damage done and a desire to repair it if possible. I wasn't sure if our marriage could survive, or even if I wanted it to, but his willingness to give me space while we figured it out seemed like a positive sign. The company thrived under the new arrangement. With Richard's shares now under my control and a board that supported my vision, I could implement changes more quickly and completely. We expanded our sustainable manufacturing practices, launched an apprenticeship program for furniture craftsmanship in communities where traditional manufacturing jobs had disappeared, and began exploring European markets for our higher-end pieces. 6 months after the boardroom showdown, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Patricia Wilson stood in my doorway, elegant as always in a cashmere sweater and pearls, her silver blonde hair perfectly styled. I hadn't seen her since the confrontation, as she'd boycotted all family and company events I attended. Patricia, I said, genuinely surprised. Please, come in. She sat primly on the edge of the visitor's chair, her handbag clutched tightly on her lap. This isn't easy for me, Amanda. Richard doesn't know I'm here, and he would be furious if he found out. I waited, giving her space to continue at her own pace. Richard is suffering, she said finally. His identity was completely wrapped up in this company. Without it, he seems lost. He spends his days staring out windows or walking alone around the golf course without actually playing. I'm worried about him. It wasn't what I'd expected. Not an apology or an olive branch, but a report on Richard's deteriorating mental state. I'm sorry to hear that, Patricia, truly. But I'm not sure what you're asking of me. I don't know either, she admitted, surprising me with her candor. I suppose I thought. You won the battle, Amanda. You have the company. You have the control Richard cherished. Perhaps there's some way to give him back a sense of purpose without undermining what you've accomplished. I considered her words carefully. Despite everything Richard had done, the dismissal, the undermining, the attempt to sell to Blackwell, I didn't want him to suffer. Not just for Daniel's sake, but because I understood how identity could be tied to work, to purpose, to feeling valued. The Wilson Legacy Museum, I said finally. We've been talking about creating a showcase of the company's history for our 75th anniversary next year. Original designs, photographs, the story of how his father started with a single workshop. Richard knows that history better than anyone. He could curate it if he were interested. Patricia looked at me searchingly, perhaps trying to detect if this was some sort of trick or humiliation. A museum? The Wilson name built this company, Patricia. I've never denied that. The craftsmanship, the design philosophy, the commitment to quality. Those all came from Richard's father and from Richard himself in the early days. That deserves to be honored, regardless of our personal differences. For the first time since I'd known her, Patricia's perfectly composed facade cracked slightly. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'll speak to him about it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't promise he'll agree." "The offer is genuine," I assured her. "Not out of pity, but because it would be valuable to the company and might be meaningful to him." She nodded, gathering herself. As she stood to leave, she paused. "For what it's worth, Amanda, I don't think you're worthless. I never did. You were simply different from what I expected for Daniel, for the family." It wasn't an apology, not really. But from Patricia Wilson, it was perhaps the closest I would ever get. "Different isn't always bad," I said gently. "Sometimes it's exactly what's needed." After she left, I sat for a long time, thinking about legacies and family and the strange path that had brought me here. I had never set out to take control of Wilson Manufacturing. I'd simply wanted my contributions to be acknowledged, my professional abilities respected. But life rarely follows the paths we expect, and sometimes the greatest opportunities emerge from our deepest wounds. That evening, I called my parents, something I did more regularly now that the crisis had passed. My father answered, his familiar voice grounding me as it always had. "How's my corporate warrior doing?" he asked, the pride evident in his tone. I smiled at the nickname. "Good days and challenging ones, Dad, but mostly good. Your mother and I were just looking at flights to come visit next month. If that works for you and Daniel?" I hesitated. My parents knew things were strained between us, but not the full extent. "Daniel might be traveling for work," I hedged, "but I'd love to have you stay with me either way." "Amanda," my father said, his voice softening. "You know we're proud of you, right? Everything you've accomplished. But we're more proud of who you are. Your integrity, your determination. Those matter more than titles or corner offices." Tears pricked at my eyes unexpectedly. "I know, Dad." "Good. Now tell me about this apprenticeship program you mentioned last time." "Sounds like something your grandfather would have loved." As I described the initiative to train a new generation of furniture craftspeople, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The Wilson Manufacturing I was building might not look exactly like the one Richard had envisioned, but in many ways, it was truer to the company's original spirit, valuing craftsmanship, community, and forward-thinking innovation. The path ahead wasn't clear. My marriage remained a question mark. Richard's involvement with the museum project was uncertain, and running a company while navigating complex family dynamics would never be simple. But for the first time since that Thanksgiving dinner when Uncle James had called me worthless, I felt fully confident in my place at Wilson Manufacturing, not as Daniel's wife or Richard's daughter-in-law, but as the leader the company needed. Sometimes, I reflected, the most valuable contributions come from the places and the people we least expect. The Wilsons were slowly learning that lesson, and in teaching it to them, I had discovered strengths in myself I hadn't known existed. 1 year had passed since I took control of Wilson Manufacturing. The company's 75th anniversary gala was scheduled for the weekend, transforming the Chicago Cultural Center with its stunning Tiffany dome into a showcase of our heritage and future. As I reviewed the final preparations from my office, a message from Megan lit up my phone. Dad agreed to attend. Mom convinced him it would look worse if he didn't show. Brace yourself. I set the phone down, a mixture of tension and relief washing over me. Richard had ultimately accepted the museum curator position, though our interactions remained strictly professional and ice-cold. He worked primarily from home, communicating through formal emails and occasional conference calls. This would be the first company event he'd attend since the boardroom confrontation. Lisa knocked on my open door. "Final revenue numbers for the quarter," she said, handing me a report. "We're up 28% year over year. The European expansion is exceeding projections." "Perfect timing before the gala," I replied, scanning the impressive figures. "The board will be pleased." "Speaking of the board," Lisa said carefully, Margaret Chen mentioned that Thomas Hadley has been meeting with Richard regularly. Might be nothing, but Thomas had been Richard's lone supporter during the Blackwell confrontation, remaining on the board but rarely contributing during meetings. Keep an eye on it, I said. Richard wouldn't try the same strategy twice, but he might have other ideas. The anniversary celebration represented more than just 75 years of business history. It was a statement about the company's transformation and future direction. We'd invited industry leaders, major clients, press, and all current and former employees. The guest list topped 500 people, the largest event in Wilson manufacturing history. I'd commissioned a documentary about the company, featuring interviews with longtime craftspeople alongside archival footage of the original workshop. Richard had actually done remarkable work with the historical exhibits, setting aside his animosity, long enough to create a meaningful tribute to his father and grandfather. Pride in the family legacy apparently ran deeper than his resentment toward me. Daniel and I had reached an uneasy truce in our marriage. After 3 months in separate bedrooms and weekly couples therapy sessions, we'd begun rebuilding something, resembling a partnership. The foundation was different now, built on clearer communication and revised expectations, rather than the easy chemistry and unexamined assumptions of our early relationship. We both married people who didn't fully exist, our therapist had observed during a breakthrough session. Amanda married a man she believed valued her professional abilities, while Daniel married a woman he thought would prioritize his family, legacy above her own identity. You're both now getting to know who you actually married. It was an uncomfortable truth, but one that had helped us move forward. Daniel had been working to establish his own identity within the company, taking charge of manufacturing operations, an area where he genuinely excelled once freed from his father's shadow. We'd found a rhythm in our professional relationship that was beginning to translate into our personal life as well. The night before the gala, we sat on our condo balcony sharing a bottle of wine, the Chicago skyline glittering before us. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Daniel asked. "About Dad being there?" I considered the question. Not nervous exactly. More prepared. Your father has never been unpredictable. He disapproves of me, resents my position, and will likely make that clear in subtle ways while maintaining a public facade of family unity. Daniel winced. That's remarkably accurate. The question is whether he'll eventually move past it. I continued. The museum project seems to have given him some purpose, at least. Mom says he's obsessed with it, actually. Spends hours going through old photographs and company records. Daniel swirled his wine thoughtfully. I think he's trying to remind himself, and everyone else, that Wilson Manufacturing existed before you came along. It absolutely did, I agreed. And the Wilsons built something remarkable. I've never denied that. They just couldn't adapt. When the market changed. Daniel reached for my hand, a gesture that had become less frequent during our marital strain. You know what I realized recently? If you had come to Dad with your ideas 3 years ago, and he had actually listened, hired, you as a consultant implemented your strategies, we'd all be celebrating your brilliance together. Instead of this. Osh, he gestured vaguely. Civil war we've been fighting. I laced my fingers through his. Your father would never have listened to me 3 years ago. Or 1 year ago. Or yesterday. That's the point, Daniel. It wasn't about the ideas themselves. It was about who was allowed to have them. The following evening, I stood at the entrance of the Chicago Cultural Center, greeting guests as they arrived. I'd chosen a deep blue gown for the occasion, elegant but understated. This night wasn't about me. It was about celebrating the company's legacy while pointing toward its future. Patricia and Richard arrived precisely at the stated start time, perfectly coordinated in their formal wear. Patricia gave me a stiff kiss on the cheek. Richard opted for a curt nod. Amanda, he acknowledged tightly. Quite the production you've arranged. The historical exhibits are the highlight, I replied sincerely. You've done remarkable work capturing the company's heritage, Richard. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise at the genuine compliment, perhaps. Yes, well, someone needed to ensure the Wilson family contributions weren't erased from the narrative. Before I could respond, he moved past me into the venue. Patricia lingered a moment. He worked day and night on those exhibits, she said quietly. It's the first time I've seen him truly engaged in months. I meant what I said. The historical section is extraordinary. Patricia nodded, something almost like gratitude in her expression before she followed her husband. The gala itself was a triumph. The main hall sparkled with elegant decorations, featuring furniture pieces from every era of Wilson manufacturing, from the original hand-carved rocking chairs that Richard's grandfather had built to our latest award-winning modern designs. The documentary played on large screens throughout the venue, while cocktail servers circulated with signature drinks named after company milestones. I was speaking with a group of European distributors when I noticed a commotion near the historical exhibit. Richard stood at the center, his face flushed, gesturing angrily at one of the display panels. Daniel was beside him, attempting to calm the situation. I excused myself and moved quickly across the room. As I approached, I could hear Richard's raised voice. This is deliberate erasure. It's a manipulation of history. Dad, please, Daniel urged. This isn't the place. What seems to be the problem? I asked calmly, conscious of nearby guests pretending not to listen. Richard turned to me, fury evident in his expression. This display on the company's financial evolution conveniently omits the period from 1985 to 2010, the years when I expanded Wilson manufacturing across 3 states and tripled our revenue. I examined the timeline panel. He was right. There was a significant gap in the financial history display, jumping from the founder's era to the recent turnaround. This is clearly an intentional effort to diminish my contributions, Richard continued, his voice tight with anger. To suggest that nothing of value happened until you arrived. It was a mistake, not malice. The design team had created the panel based on available financial records, and there had been gaps in the documentation for those years. But explaining that would only make Richard feel defensive about his record-keeping. You're absolutely right, Richard, I said instead. This is an unfortunate oversight that needs immediate correction. Your leadership during that period was crucial to the company's growth. My acknowledgement seemed to catch him off guard. He'd clearly been prepared for a defensive response that would justify his outrage. I'll have the design team create a new panel specifically highlighting the expansions you led, I continued. In fact, would you be willing to provide more details about those achievements? We could include photographs of the facility openings, perhaps? For a moment, confusion replaced anger in Richard's expression. He'd expected a confrontation, not collaboration. I have extensive records in my home office, and photographs from the ribbon cuttings. Perfect. We'll make this right. I signaled to the event coordinator. Please mark this panel for immediate replacement and schedule time next week for Richard to provide additional materials for a comprehensive display on the 1985 to 2010 expansion period. As the coordinator noted the instructions, I addressed Richard directly. Your legacy deserves proper recognition, Richard. I apologize for this oversight. He stared at me, seemingly trying to detect insincerity or manipulation. Finding none, he gave a curt nod. See that it's corrected properly. As he walked away, Daniel exhaled slowly beside me. That could have gone much worse. It wasn't worth turning into a scene, I replied. Besides, he's not wrong. His contributions should be acknowledged, regardless of our personal conflicts. Daniel studied me with newfound appreciation. A year ago, I would have expected you to defend the panel or blame the design team. A year ago, I was still fighting to prove my value, I replied. Now I'm focused on building something sustainable, and that includes respecting the company's full history, not just the chapters I wrote. The remainder of the evening unfolded without incident. The formal program included a speech from Daniel about the company's history and values, followed by my presentation on our vision for the future, international expansion, sustainable manufacturing practices, and innovative designs that honored traditional craftsmanship. I made a point of acknowledging each era of leadership, including Richard's decades at the helm and his expansion initiatives. When I mentioned his name, directing attention to the historical exhibits he had curated, the applause was genuine and enthusiastic. Richard's expression remained impassive, but Patricia dabbed at her eyes beside him. After the formal presentations, as guests mingled and explored the exhibits, Margaret Chen approached me. "Masterfully handled," she said, handing me a glass of champagne. "Both the presentation and the earlier situation with Richard." "Thank you. It's been a complex year of transitions." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "You know, when you first proposed buying Richard's shares, I supported you primarily because of the financial case you presented. The company was clearly performing better under your guidance." "And now?" I asked. "Now I see that you understand something Richard never did, that preserving a legacy isn't about maintaining absolute control. It's about allowing it to evolve while honoring its foundations." She smiled. "The Wilson name is in better hands than it's been in decades, even if those hands weren't born a Wilson." As the evening wound down, I found myself standing alone before a black and white photograph of Richard's grandfather in his original workshop. The image captured him bent over a hand-carved chair, totally absorbed in his craft, oblivious to the camera. There was something powerful in his concentration, his commitment to creating something of lasting beauty and utility. He worked 16-hour days, even after the business started growing. Richard's voice came from behind me. "My father wanted to hire more help, but grandfather insisted on personally finishing every piece that left the workshop." I turned to find Richard studying the photograph, something softer in his expression than I'd seen in months. "That level of dedication is rare," I said. "It's what built the Wilson reputation for quality." Richard nodded, still looking at his grandfather's image. He used to say that his name was on every piece, whether it was visible or not, that creating something worthwhile was a sacred trust. We stood in silence for a moment, both contemplating the man who had started this company 75 years ago, never imagining the complex familial drama that would unfold around his legacy. "Your historical exhibits captured his spirit perfectly," I said finally. "You've preserved something valuable for future generations." Richard glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "The past is easy to preserve, Amanda. It's already happened. The future is the greater challenge." With that cryptic comment, he rejoined Patricia across the room, leaving me to wonder if it had been a simple observation or something more significant, perhaps the smallest opening for a different kind of relationship moving forward. The gala's success rippled through the company in the following weeks. Industry publications featured extensive coverage, highlighting both our rich history and innovative direction. Several major retailers increased their orders after seeing the new product lines showcased at the event. Even our stock value, though we remained privately held, was estimated to have increased by nearly 12%, based on the positive press and growing market position. The corrected historical panel was installed within a week, with Richard providing extensive materials documenting his tenure. The resulting display was actually more comprehensive and impressive than it would have been originally, a case where addressing a conflict had created something better than avoiding it. Daniel and I continued our careful relationship reconstruction. Small moments of connection accumulated, shared laughter over breakfast, thoughtful gestures, honest conversations about our expectations and disappointments. Love had never been our problem. Understanding and respect had been the missing elements, and those couldn't be rushed back into existence. One evening, as we reviewed quarterly reports in our home office, Daniel looked up suddenly. "Do you regret it?" Marrying me? The question caught me off guard. No, I answered honestly, but I regret that we didn't truly know each other when we did. He nodded slowly. I saw what I wanted to see. The accomplished, beautiful woman who seemed impressed by me, by my family. I never stopped to consider that you might have ambitions beyond being a Wilson wife. And I saw a man who valued my mind, I replied. I didn't realize how much your identity was tied to your family's approval, especially your father's. Daniel winced but didn't disagree. Do you think we would have married if we'd seen each other clearly from the beginning? I considered the question carefully. I don't know, but I think we might have built something more honest from the start. And now? He asked, vulnerability evident in his voice. Can we build something honest from here? I reached across the desk to take his hand. I think we're already trying. And that counts for something. The conversation marked a turning point in our recovery. We began discussing the possibility of having children, something we'd planned before everything unraveled, but had set aside during the turmoil. The prospect of creating our own family unit, with values and traditions we would define together, felt like a potential new chapter. Meanwhile, Wilson Manufacturing continued its upward trajectory. The European expansion exceeded our projections, with particularly strong reception in Scandinavian markets, where our blend of craftsmanship and modern design resonated with local aesthetics. Our apprenticeship program had expanded to 5 cities, creating pathways to skilled manufacturing careers for hundreds of young people. Richard's involvement with the company gradually evolved from purely historical documentation to occasional consultation on traditional craftsmanship techniques. He remained distant and formal with me, but the open hostility had subsided into something more like reluctant coexistence. I counted this as progress, however minimal. 4 months after the AT Gala, I received an unexpected invitation to meet Richard for lunch. We had not shared a meal alone since before the boardroom confrontation. I accepted with cautious curiosity. We met at an old-school steakhouse that had been a Wilson family favorite for decades. Richard was already seated when I arrived, nursing what appeared to be a scotch on the rocks despite the early hour. Amanda, he acknowledged as I sat down. Thank you for coming. Of course. Is everything all right? He waved away my concern. Everything's fine. I didn't ask you here to discuss problems. The waiter appeared, and Richard ordered without consulting the menu, clearly a regular patron. I followed suit with a simple salad and iced tea. When we were alone again, Richard seemed to struggle with where to begin. I waited patiently, allowing him the space to find his words. Patricia tells me you and Daniel are considering starting a family, he said finally. Not what I had expected. We're discussing it, I confirmed. Nothing decided yet. Richard nodded, staring into his scotch. Wilson children have always been taught the business from an early age. Daniel used to sit on my lap during meetings, when he was too young for school. Megan, too, though she never showed much interest. I wasn't sure how to respond to this apparent nostalgia, so I simply nodded. What I'm trying to say, Richard continued with visible effort, is that if you do have children, I would like. That is, I hope you would allow me to share certain traditions with them, to teach them about their heritage in the business. The request surprised me. Richard had barely spoken to me in months, and now he was thinking about his role as a potential grandfather. Of course they would know their heritage, I said carefully. Your contributions to the company would certainly be part of their education. Richard set down his glass with deliberate precision. Amanda, I'm not asking for your permission to be mentioned in some corporate history lesson. I'm asking if you would allow me to have a relationship with my grandchildren despite our differences. The vulnerability in the question was so unexpected that I found myself momentarily at a loss for words. This proud, difficult man was essentially asking if I would use any future children as pawns in our ongoing conflict. "Richard," I said finally, "whatever issues exist between us, they would never extend to your relationship with your grandchildren. Family is family." Something flickered across his face, relief perhaps, or surprise at my response. "Family is family," he repeated quietly. Yes. Our meals arrived, creating a natural pause in the conversation. As we began eating, Richard seemed to gather himself for what I suspected was the real purpose of this meeting. "I've been doing a great deal of thinking over these past months," he said, his tone more businesslike now. "About the company, about legacy, about adaptation." I listened attentively, curious where this was heading. When my father handed me control of Wilson Manufacturing, the world was different. American manufacturing dominated. Craftsmanship was valued over price, and competition was primarily local or regional. He cut his steak with precise movements. I built on what he created, expanded our reach, but fundamentally, I maintained his approach because it worked. It worked for a long time, I acknowledged. Until it didn't, Richard conceded, surprising me again. Until the market changed in ways I either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. This was as close to admitting failure as I had ever heard from Richard Wilson. "What I'm trying to say, rather poorly," he continued, "is that while I still believe you went about things in the wrong way, I can't argue with the results. The company is thriving under your leadership. The Wilson legacy continues, even if not as I envisioned it." I set down my fork, giving him my full attention. "Thank you for saying that, Richard. It means a lot coming from you." He nodded curtly, uncomfortable with the emotion underlying our conversation. "I've asked Thomas to step down from the board. His, loyalty to me has prevented him from objectively evaluating company decisions. That's not serving anyone's interests at this point." This was significant. Thomas had been Richard's last ally on the board, his potential foothold for any future attempts to regain influence. "I've suggested Margaret Chen's associate, Dr. James Liu, as a replacement. He has extensive experience in international manufacturing and sustainable practices, areas where we're expanding." Richard took a sip of his scotch. "I believe you'll find him to be a valuable addition." I studied Richard carefully, looking for hidden motives in this apparent olive branch. Finding none, I nodded. "I'll speak with Margaret about the recommendation. If Dr. Liu's qualifications align with our needs, I'd welcome his expertise." "Good." Richard seemed relieved to have completed what was evidently a difficult task for him. The remainder of our lunch focused on safer topics: the upcoming furniture, Expo in Milan, Megan's recent art exhibition, Patricia's charity work. As we prepared to leave, Richard hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. "One more thing. I found this while organizing materials for the historical exhibit." He handed me a faded photograph. It showed a woman in 1940s attire standing proudly beside an ornate wooden desk, her hand resting possessively on its carved edge. "My grandmother," Richard explained. "What few people know is that she designed many of our earliest signature pieces, including that desk, which won several craftsmanship awards. My grandfather built them, but the aesthetic vision was often hers." I studied the image with new interest, noting the confidence in the woman's posture, the intelligent gleam in her eye. "Why isn't she featured in the company history?" Richard's mouth tightened. It wasn't considered appropriate at the time for a woman to receive credit for furniture design. The official story became that my grandfather did everything. The parallels were not subtle. "Thank you for sharing this with me," I said simply. "History has a way of repeating itself, though not always in the ways we expect," Richard replied. "Perhaps it's time for a more complete telling of the Wilson story." As we parted ways outside the restaurant, Richard extended his hand formally. I took it, feeling the significance of this small gesture of respect. Amanda, he said, meeting. My eyes directly. I still don't like how this all unfolded. I probably never will. But the company is in capable hands, and the Wilson legacy continues. In the end, perhaps that's what matters most. It wasn't forgiveness or acceptance exactly, but from Richard Wilson, it was an extraordinary concession. A recognition, however grudging, that perhaps value could come from unexpected sources, even from the daughter-in-law he had once dismissed as worthless. Driving back to the office, I found myself thinking about Richard's grandmother, her designs uncredited for decades while her husband received the accolades. I thought about the generations of women whose contributions had been minimized or erased, whose ideas had been attributed to the men around them. Then I thought about my potential future children, Wilson heirs who would grow up in a different world, knowing that their mother had taken a struggling family business and transformed it into something stronger, more resilient, more suited to the changing times. They would know their great-great-grandmother had been a designer whose vision had shaped the company's earliest successes. They would understand that legacy wasn't just about bearing a name, but about contributing value, regardless of where you came from. As I pulled into the Wilson manufacturing parking lot, I made a mental note to create a new historical display, one featuring Richard's grandmother prominently alongside her husband, giving credit where it had long been denied. It wouldn't change the past, but it might help shape the future. And in the end, that was the greatest legacy any of us could hope to leave. 2 years after taking control of Wilson Manufacturing, I found myself sitting in a hospital waiting room, exhausted but exhilarated. After 14 hours of labor, I had given birth to twins, a boy and a girl. Daniel had just stepped out to call his parents with the news, leaving me in a moment of peaceful solitude with our newborns sleeping in the bassinet beside me. I studied their tiny faces, searching for traces of family resemblance. Sophia had Daniel's chin and, according to the nurses, my eyes, though it was too early to tell for certain. James, named after my father, had a dusting of dark hair and long fingers that already reminded me of the craftsman who had built Wilson Manufacturing's reputation. The door opened quietly, and to my surprise, Patricia entered, carrying an enormous arrangement of flowers. Her eyes immediately went to the babies, her expression softening in a way I'd rarely seen. "They're beautiful, Amanda," she said, setting down the flowers and approaching the bassinet with reverent steps. "Would you like to hold one?" I offered. Patricia looked startled, then pleased. "I would, yes." I carefully lifted Sophia and placed her in Patricia's arms. The older woman's practiced movements suggested she remembered well how to hold an infant, despite the decades since her own children were born. "Daniel tells me you've named them Sophia and James," she said, gently rocking my daughter. "Yes. Sophia after my grandmother, and James after my father." Patricia nodded, still gazing at the baby. "Strong names. Good names." She hesitated, then added, "Richard is parking the car. We weren't sure if you'd want him here." The fact that Richard had come at all was significant. Our relationship had gradually improved from icy silence to cautious civility over the past year, but deep warming had been slow to follow. "Of course he should be here," I said. "They're his grandchildren, too." Patricia's eyes met mine, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. The battle for control of Wilson Manufacturing might have created divisions in the family, but these newborns represented something new, a future that didn't need to be constrained by past conflicts. Richard appeared in the doorway moments later, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. In his hands, he held 2 small packages wrapped in cream-colored paper. "Congratulations," he said stiffly, his gaze moving between me and the babies. "Everyone is." "Well?" "Everyone is perfect," I assured him. "Would you like to meet your grandson?" I lifted James from the bassinet, noticing how Richard's expression changed as he approached. The stern businessman vanished, replaced by something softer and more vulnerable. When I placed James in his arms, Richard's hands trembled slightly. "Hello there," he murmured to the baby. "Welcome to the family, young man." Daniel returned to find his parents each holding one of our children, a tableau of family continuity I hadn't been certain would ever exist. The emotion on his face as he took in the scene told me he understood the significance, too. "They're already practicing their grandparent duties," I said, smiling at my husband. "Dad was just telling me he's ordered custom cradles," Daniel replied, sitting on the edge of my bed. Apparently, he's been in the workshop for weeks, designing them himself. I looked at Richard in surprise. "You made them cradles?" Richard cleared his throat, seeming almost embarrassed. "It's tradition. Wilson, children have always slept in handcrafted cradles. Mine was made by my grandfather. Daniel's by me." He met my eyes briefly. These two deserve the same. The gesture touched me deeply. Whatever Richard's feelings toward me might be, he had chosen to welcome his grandchildren with the most meaningful gift he could offer, something created with his own hands, continuing a family tradition. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "That means a great deal to us." Richard nodded, attention returning to James. "This one has the Wilson hands. Long fingers, see? Born to work with wood." "Or to play piano," I suggested. "My mother was a music teacher." "Or both," Daniel added diplomatically. "No reason he can't appreciate multiple family traditions." Patricia had been quietly humming to Sophia, who remained peacefully asleep. "I took the liberty of setting up the nursery at our house," she said, "for when you're ready to have an evening out and need grandparents to step in. No pressure, of course." The idea of Richard and Patricia caring for our children, something I might have found anxiety-inducing not long ago, now seemed natural and right. Whatever our differences, I had no doubt they would love these babies fiercely and protectively. "We'll take you up on that," I assured her. "Probably sooner than you think, given how little sleep we're functioning on already." A nurse appeared to check my vitals and the babies, prompting Richard and Patricia to reluctantly hand the twins back. As they prepared to leave, Richard placed the 2 small packages on the side table. "Just a small tradition," he explained. "When a Wilson child is born." After they departed, I opened the packages while Daniel held the twins. Each contained a small wooden box, exquisitely crafted with the baby's initials inlaid in contrasting wood. Inside Sophia's was a delicate pearl bracelet. Inside James's, a pair of silver cufflinks. "These were my grandfather's," Daniel said, recognizing the cufflinks. "Dad wore them at our wedding." I touched the pearls gently. "And I'm guessing these have similar significance?" Daniel nodded. "They've been passed down to Wilson daughters for generations. Usually given on their wedding day, but..." He smiled. "I think Dad's making a statement. That Sophia is a true Wilson, despite having me for a mother?" I suggested, but without bitterness. "That both of our children are Wilsons," Daniel corrected. "And that he's accepted you as part of the family in his own complicated way." The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights, board meetings conducted with babies napping in a corner of my office, and a new kind of negotiation with Daniel about balancing work and family responsibilities. We were fortunate to have resources many new parents lacked, the flexibility of leadership positions, a supportive, if sometimes overbearing, extended family, and the financial means to create whatever support systems we needed. Still, the challenge of maintaining the company's momentum while adapting to parenthood tested us both. Daniel threw himself into fatherhood with the same dedication he'd shown in manufacturing operations, often arriving at work with spit up on his suit jacket and dark circles under his eyes. I found myself making tough choices about which meetings required my physical presence and which could be handled remotely or delegated. To my surprise, Richard and Patricia became our most reliable support system. Patricia would appear at our door with homemade meals and practical baby supplies. Richard, who had never changed a diaper during his own children's infancy, now proudly demonstrated his newly acquired skills with his grandchildren. "Dad was never like this with us," Megan remarked one Sunday afternoon as we watched Richard, on the floor of our living room, patiently building a block tower for Sophia to knock down. I don't think I sat on his lap until I was old enough to discuss quarterly earnings. "Grandparenting is different," I suggested. "Less pressure, more joy." Megan smiled wryly. Maybe, or maybe losing control of the company was the best thing. That ever happened to him. Forced him to find identity and purpose beyond being CEO. There was truth in her observation. Richard had gradually expanded his involvement beyond the museum project, teaching traditional woodworking classes for our apprentices and consulting on historically inspired designs for our heritage collection. His expertise was genuinely valuable, and the respect he received for his craftsmanship seemed to fulfill something that his authoritarian leadership style never had. When the twins were 8 months old, I faced my first major crisis since becoming a mother. Our largest supplier of sustainably harvested hardwoods suffered a devastating warehouse fire, threatening to disrupt production across all our lines. The situation required immediate attention, including an emergency trip to Oregon to assess the damage and meet with potential alternative suppliers. "I can handle the meetings here," Daniel assured me as I packed. "Mom's already volunteered for extra grandparent duty." I hesitated, holding a framed photo of the twins that I'd been considering packing. "It's 3 days, the longest I've been away from them." Daniel took the frame gently from my hands. "They'll be fine. You'll be fine. The company needs you to solve this, and then you'll come home to us." His confidence helped steady me. This was the partnership we'd been rebuilding, supporting each other's roles both at home and at work, without the unnecessary competition or hidden resentments that had once characterized our relationship. The Oregon trip was productive, but grueling. I visited the damaged facility, met with 7 potential new suppliers, and negotiated emergency arrangements to minimize disruption to our production schedule. Throughout, I FaceTimed with Daniel and the twins twice daily, the sight of their chubby faces and reaching hands simultaneously warming my heart and intensifying my homesickness. When I returned to Chicago late on the 3rd evening, exhausted, but satisfied with the crisis management, I found a surprising scene at home. Richard sat in our living room, wearing reading glasses and what appeared to be one of the twins' pureed carrots on his shirt sleeve, reviewing manufacturing specifications while both babies slept against his chest. He looked up as I entered, speaking quietly to avoid waking them. Daniel had to handle an issue at the Southside facility. Patricia's at her charity board meeting. I told them I could manage. The image of Richard Wilson, who had once dismissed me as worthless, now serving as backup childcare while reviewing technical documents, struck me as surreal. "You didn't have to do that," I said, setting down my bags. "I'm sure you had other commitments." "Nothing more important than family," Richard replied simply. Then, nodding to the documents, "These Southeast Asian timber specifications look promising. Smart thinking, sourcing from multiple regions to reduce future vulnerability." The casual way he offered both grandfatherly care and professional approval felt like crossing into new territory in our relationship. I sat in the adjacent chair, drinking in the sight of my children after 3 days away. "They've missed you," Richard said, following my gaze. "James refused his bottle twice yesterday. Patricia says he has your stubborn streak." "Wonder where I got that from," I replied with a small smile. Richard actually chuckled, a rare sound. "Certainly not from the Wilson side. We're famously flexible and easygoing." The shared joke, however mild, marked yet another small step in our evolving dynamic. When Daniel arrived home 30 minutes later, he paused in the doorway, taking in the unexpected scene of his wife and father engaged in comfortable conversation while the twins slept peacefully. "Well," he said softly, "this is nice." As the twins approached their first birthday, Wilson Manufacturing reached another milestone. Our products were now being sold in 28 countries, and our sustainable manufacturing practices had earned industry recognition with a prestigious Global Design Award. The company Richard's grandfather had started in a small Chicago workshop had evolved into an international brand known for blending traditional craftsmanship with forward-thinking business practices. The twins' birthday celebration became an unexpected symbol of the family's transformation. Patricia insisted on hosting at the Wilson family home, the colonial mansion in Lake Forest, where I had once felt like an unwelcome outsider. Now, Sophia and James had their own dedicated playroom there, filled with handcrafted wooden toys made by their grandfather. The guest list included board members, close friends, and key company employees alongside family. Lisa Johnson arrived. With her wife and daughter, Margaret Chen brought her grandchildren to play with the twins, and even Megan's new boyfriend, a sculptor she'd met through her work with our design team, was welcomed into the fold. While helping Patricia arrange flower centerpieces for the garden tables, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in 3 years. The woman who had once been coldly dismissive was now chatting companionably about the twins' developing personalities and soliciting my opinion on the upcoming charity gala she was chairing. "Sophia has your determination," Patricia remarked, adjusting a peony. "The way she keeps trying until she masters something, that's all you." "And James has Daniel's easy laugh," I replied. "Though I see Richard in him too, especially when he's concentrating on building something." Patricia nodded, her expression softening. "Richard says the same thing. He's been designing their first workbenches, you know. Child-sized ones for when they're ready to learn basic woodworking. They're not even walking steadily yet," I laughed. "Wilson planning," Patricia said with a knowing smile. "Always thinking generations ahead." During the birthday celebration, I found myself standing slightly apart, watching the scene with a sense of wonder. Richard was showing James how to bang a toy wooden hammer, while Daniel helped Sophia toddle from one guest to another, accepting birthday wishes with suspicious sideways glances. Board members chatted with factory supervisors, Megan's art world. Friends mingled with Patricia's society connections, and throughout there was a sense of genuine community. Lisa approached, handing me a glass of champagne. "Quite the transformation," she observed, following my gaze across the gathering. "In the company and the family." "Sometimes I can hardly believe it myself," I admitted. "You know," Lisa said, thoughtfully, "when you first exposed your role in saving the company, most of us thought Richard would never recover from the humiliation. The board was prepared for years of power struggles and family drama." "There was certainly some of that," I acknowledged. "Yes, but look at him now." She nodded toward Richard, who was demonstrating proper hammer technique with exaggerated patience. "He's found a new role that actually seems to make him happier than being CEO ever did. And the company's stronger for having both your vision and his experience in their proper places." It was true. Once Richard accepted that he couldn't regain control of daily operations, he had gradually leaned into his role as keeper of the Wilson craftsmanship tradition. His woodworking classes for apprentices had a waiting list, and his expertise had proven invaluable in maintaining quality standards as we expanded production. "The irony," I said quietly, "is that if they had valued my input from the beginning, none of the drama would have been necessary. We could have collaborated instead of fought." "True," Lisa agreed. "But would Richard have ever truly respected your contribution if he hadn't first experienced losing control? Sometimes people need to hit bottom before they can rebuild on a stronger foundation." As the party wound down and guests began to depart, Daniel gathered everyone's attention for a toast. Standing with both babies now drowsy in their high chairs, he raised his glass. 3 years ago, Wilson Manufacturing was struggling to survive, he began. Today, we're thriving beyond what any of us thought possible. That transformation happened because Amanda refused to be underestimated, because she fought for her place at the table, even when that table belonged to a family that didn't initially welcome her. I felt a flush of emotion at his public acknowledgement, so different from the husband who had once allowed his family to dismiss me. But equally important, Daniel continued, has been our ability to find a new balance, to integrate traditional Wilson values with fresh perspectives. My father's craftsmanship and history, with my wife's innovation and vision. The result is stronger than either approach alone could have been. He smiled at the twins, now both fighting sleep despite the excitement. Sophia and James represent that integration. They carry the Wilson name and heritage, but also Amanda's determination and fresh perspective. They'll grow up understanding both the value of tradition and the necessity of evolution. Richard stepped forward, his own glass raised. If I may add something. He cleared his throat, visibly emotional. When I took over this company from my father, I believed my sole responsibility was to preserve what he had built, to maintain the Wilson way of doing things, unchanged and unchallenged. He looked directly at me, his expression open in a way I'd rarely seen. Amanda taught me, somewhat forcefully, that preservation without adaptation is ultimately a path to extinction. True legacy isn't about maintaining absolute control. It's about creating something strong enough to evolve without losing its essential character. The acknowledgement, delivered publicly before family, friends, and colleagues, carried a weight that no private conversation could have matched. This wasn't just Richard accepting me as his grandchildren's mother. This was professional respect from a man who had once considered me worthless in a business context. To Sophia and James, Richard concluded, may they inherit the best of both their parents, and may they lead Wilson Manufacturing into a future none of us can yet imagine. As glasses clinked and the twins were swept up for their baths and bedtime, I found myself alone with Richard for a moment on the garden terrace. The late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the manicured lawn, and somewhere in the distance, a wind chime gently sounded. You meant what you said? I asked quietly. About adaptation being necessary for legacy? Richard gazed out over the property, his profile sharp against the setting sun. When I was fighting you for control of the company, I believed I was protecting our heritage. It took me too long to realize that the true threat to that heritage was my own rigidity. He turned to face me directly. My father adapted to the post-war economic boom. I adapted to the manufacturing challenges of the 70s and 80s. I simply failed to recognize when it was time for the next evolution. It's not easy to see the need for change when you're in the midst of it, I offered, especially when that change means stepping back from leadership. Richard nodded slowly. At Thanksgiving 3 years ago, when James called you worthless, I didn't contradict him. Not because I fully agreed, but because I couldn't see past my own preconceptions about what value meant in our company. I was wrong, and I owe you an apology for that. The moment felt monumental. Richard Wilson acknowledging a mistake, offering an apology without qualification or deflection. The man who had sat silently as his brother insulted me was now capable of this humility. I appreciate that, I said simply. And I want you to know that I've always recognized the value you built. Here, my goal was never to erase the Wilson legacy, but to ensure it continued. I understand that now. He glanced back toward the house where we could see Daniel carrying a sleepy James up the stairs. And I'm grateful, though it's taken me far too long to say so. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the sun sink lower on the horizon. Finally, Richard spoke again, his tone lighter. So, about the European manufacturing facility. I've been reviewing the proposals, And I have some thoughts on the Portugal location versus the Sweden option. I smiled at this return to business. Matters, but noted how different it felt now. A genuine exchange of ideas rather than a power struggle. I'd be interested in your perspective. The craftsmanship traditions are different in each region. Exactly. Richard nodded approvingly. The Swedish approach aligns more closely with our traditional joinery methods, but the Portuguese wood selection offers advantages for our contemporary lines. As we discussed the technical merits of each option, I realized how far we had come. The man who had once dismissed my business input was now seeking it, offering his expertise as a complement to my strategic vision rather than a challenge to it. Later that evening, after the twins were asleep in the custom cradles Richard had crafted for them, Daniel and I stood in our home overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city lights glittered against the darkness, a fitting backdrop for reflection. "That went better than I could have imagined," Daniel said, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "Dad actually apologized, didn't he?" "He did," I confirmed, still somewhat amazed. "And meant it, I think." Wonders never cease. Daniel rested his chin on my shoulder. "You know, when this all started, when you exposed your role at the company, I was terrified we'd lost everything. The business, the family relationships, maybe even our marriage." I leaned back against him, acknowledging the difficult journey. There were moments I thought the same. "But look at what we've built instead," he continued. "Something stronger, more honest. The company's thriving, the twins are incredible, and my parents actually respect you now. Not just tolerate, genuinely respect." He was right. What had begun as a moment of painful revelation, my husband's family calling me worthless while unaware of my true contribution, had catalyzed a transformation more profound than I could have anticipated. Not just in the company's performance, but in the family's understanding of value, contribution, and legacy. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Uncle James hadn't made that comment at Thanksgiving?" I asked. "If I had just continued working behind the scenes, letting you take the credit?" Daniel considered this. "I think something would have broken eventually. That kind of arrangement wasn't sustainable, not for the company, and certainly not for us. The truth needed to come out." "But it might have happened differently," I pointed out. "Less dramatically, with fewer burnt bridges to rebuild." "Maybe," Daniel acknowledged. "But I'm not sure my father would have truly changed without that shock to his system. Some lessons come only through difficult experiences." I turned in, his arms to face him. "And what about you? What lessons did you learn?" His expression grew serious. "That standing by silently while someone dismisses your worth isn't love or loyalty. It's cowardice. That partnerships, whether in business or marriage, require honesty and mutual respect to survive. And that sometimes the person you most need to stand up to is the one who taught you everything you thought you knew." These were hard-earned insights, paid for with months of strain and uncertainty. But they had formed the foundation of our rebuilt relationship, stronger now for having been tested and reformed with clearer understanding. The twins will grow up in a different family than the one you knew, I reflected, where women's contributions are valued equally, where speaking truth is more important than maintaining appearances. "A better family," Daniel agreed. "And a better company. One that honors its history while embracing change." As we stood together, looking out at the city where Wilson manufacturing had begun 3 generations ago, I thought about Richard's words from the birthday toast. True legacy wasn't about maintaining control. It was about creating something strong enough to evolve without losing its essential character. The worth that had once been dismissed at a Thanksgiving table had transformed a struggling company, healed a fractured family, and created space for a new generation to thrive. That, I reflected, was a legacy worth building. 5 years had passed since that fateful Thanksgiving dinner. The twins were now 4 years old, running through the halls of Wilson Manufacturing headquarters as if they owned the place, which, in a sense, they did. Sophia, with her dark curls bouncing, directed her brother in their pretend office game. James followed dutifully, carrying a toy clipboard his grandfather had crafted for him. "Ms. Johnson needs these papers right away," Sophia instructed with all the authority a 4-year-old could muster. I watched from my office doorway, amused as they marched importantly past my assistant's desk. The children had become fixtures in the building, beloved by employees across all departments. The company daycare center I'd established on the ground floor had expanded to accommodate children of employees at all levels, from factory workers to executives. It had proven to be one of our most successful retention initiatives, particularly for working mothers who might otherwise have left the industry. "Future CEO in training," Lisa commented, joining me to observe the children's game. "Though I'm not sure which one." "They can run it together," I replied. "Or neither. I want them to find their own paths." This philosophy marked perhaps the greatest departure from traditional Wilson family expectations. Richard had groomed Daniel from birth to take over. Daniel and I were deliberately giving our children space to develop their own interests and strengths. Lisa handed me a folder. "Final numbers for the fiscal year. We've exceeded projections by 22%. I scanned the impressive figures. Wilson Manufacturing had nearly tripled in size since I'd taken control, expanding from a regional furniture maker to a global brand known for blending heritage craftsmanship with modern sustainability practices. Our apprenticeship programs now operated in 8 cities, creating paths to skilled manufacturing careers for young people who might otherwise have been shut out of such opportunities. The board meeting tomorrow should be celebratory," Lisa noted. 5 consecutive years of growth deserves recognition." "Bring the champagne," I agreed. "Everyone has earned it." My phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "Dad's had another idea for the anniversary collection. Headed to the workshop now. Meet us there after your call?" I smiled at his text. Richard's workshop, established in a renovated section of our main manufacturing facility, had become a creative hub where tradition and innovation merged. The retired CEO spent most days there, mentoring apprentices and developing new designs that honored Wilson's heritage while incorporating contemporary elements. What had begun as a way to give Richard purpose beyond his ceremonial title had evolved into a genuinely valuable contribution to the company's success. After completing a conference call with our European partners, I made my way to the workshop. The familiar sense of sawdust and varnish greeted me as I entered the light-filled space. Richard and Daniel stood at a workbench, examining drawings spread across the surface. The twins sat nearby, solemnly sanding small wooden blocks under the watchful eye of Luis, one of our master craftsmen. "Amanda," Richard acknowledged with a nod that carried more warmth than any outsider would detect. "Come see what we're considering for the 80th anniversary limited edition." I joined them at the bench, studying the intricate designs. "The curves echo the original 1945 collection," I observed, "but with a more minimalist approach. I like it." "The modern proportions were Daniel's suggestion," Richard said, giving credit with an ease that still occasionally surprised me. "And we're proposing sustainable hardwoods from the New Philippines Partnership for the primary construction." 5 years ago, Richard would have bristled at any suggestion to alter classic Wilson designs. Now he spoke of evolution and adaptation as naturally as he discussed traditional joinery techniques. The man who had once called me worthless in his estimation now regularly sought my input on design concepts and strategic decisions. The twins abandoned their sanding project and raced over. "Mommy, look what Grandpa showed us." James held up his small wooden block, now smooth on one side. "I did it all by myself." "Excellent craftsmanship," I said solemnly, inspecting his work. You have steady hands, just like your grandfather." Richard beamed with unrestrained pride. The children had softened him in ways business conflicts never could, creating bridges between us that we crossed more easily with each passing year. "I've been thinking," Richard said as the children returned to their project. "For the 80th anniversary celebration, we should display the full evolution of Wilson Designs, including the pieces you've introduced during your leadership." "That seems appropriate," I agreed. "The company's story isn't just about the past, it's also about how we've grown and adapted." "Exactly," Richard nodded. "Legacy isn't static. I was slow to learn that lesson, but I did learn it eventually." Daniel squeezed my hand, recognizing the significance of his father's words. The relationship between Richard and me would never be effortlessly warm, but it had evolved into something based on mutual respect, a professional appreciation that had gradually extended into our personal interactions as well. The next evening found us gathered at the Wilson family home for a milestone celebration of a different kind, Patricia and Richard's 50th wedding anniversary. The elegant affair brought together family, longtime friends, and key figures from Chicago's business community. Patricia, as gracious in her role as hostess as ever, had softened considerably toward me over the years. Our shared devotion to the twins had created common ground where business conflicts had once created division. We would never share the easy intimacy she had with Megan, but we had found a comfortable relationship based on mutual respect and genuine care for the same people. During dinner, Daniel rose to offer a toast to his parents. 50 years of partnership is an achievement worth celebrating, he began. But even more impressive is how you've both continued to grow and evolve throughout those years. He turned to his father. "Dad, you taught me the value of tradition, craftsmanship, and attention to detail. But in recent years, you've also demonstrated how to adapt with grace when circumstances change. A lesson perhaps even more valuable." Richard's expression remained composed, but I could see emotion in his eyes as his son continued. "Mom, your unwavering support of this family through challenges and transitions has been our foundation. You've shown us all how to maintain dignity and find new ways to contribute when familiar patterns shift." Patricia dabbed at her eyes, uncharacteristically emotional in public. "Together," Daniel concluded, "you've shown us that true partnership isn't about remaining exactly as you were when you began, but about growing together through whatever life presents. Amanda and I are grateful for that example." As glasses clinked around the table, Richard stood. "I appreciate those kind words, son. But if we're speaking of adaptability and growth, I must acknowledge that my greatest education in those qualities came not from choice, but from necessity." He glanced my way. "When Amanda joined this family, I saw only threat where I should have seen opportunity. I valued control over collaboration, tradition over innovation." The room had gone very quiet. Richard Wilson was not known for public vulnerability or admission of mistakes. It took me far too long to recognize that protecting the Wilson legacy didn't mean preventing change. It meant ensuring the company could thrive in changing times. For that lesson, difficult as it was to learn, I am grateful. It was as close to a public apology for his initial treatment of me as Richard would ever offer. I met his gaze across the table, acknowledging the moment with a slight nod. Some wounds heal without ever being directly addressed, the proof of healing evident in changed behavior rather than explicit words. Later, as guests mingled on the terrace under twinkling lights, Megan joined me at the stone balustrade overlooking the gardens. "That was quite a moment from Dad," she observed, sipping her champagne. 5 years ago, I'd have bet my trust fund against him ever acknowledging he was wrong about anything, let alone you." "People can surprise us," I replied, "especially when they have good reason to reconsider their positions." Megan laughed softly. "You mean when they discover the worthless daughter-in-law has been secretly driving their business success all along?" She shook her head. You know, when you exposed that at the board meeting, part of me was horrified at the family drama, but another part was cheering wildly. Someone needed to shake up the Wilson men's certainty that they alone knew what was best. It wasn't the approach I would have chosen, I admitted, but I'm not sure a gentler method would have been effective. Definitely not with Dad, Megan agreed. Sometimes you need to blow up the foundation to rebuild something stronger. The metaphor was apt. The earthquake of that confrontation had indeed destroyed old structures, of authority, of family hierarchy, of unquestioned tradition. But from those ruins, we had constructed something more resilient, a business that honored its past while embracing innovation, and a family that had learned to value contribution over position. As if summoned by our conversation, Richard approached, carrying a sleeping James in his arms. This young man crashed after his third cookie, he explained. Sophia is still going strong with her cousins in the game room. I reached for my son, but Richard shook his head. I've got him. He's not too heavy for his grandfather yet. The tenderness with which he held my child, this man who had once dismissed me as nothing more than a social climbing gold digger, spoke volumes about our journey. James stirred slightly, instinctively curling closer to his grandfather's chest, in absolute trust. He has your business instinct, Richard told me, his voice low to avoid waking the boy. The way he studies how things work, asks questions about process. Sophia has Daniel's people skills. She remembers everyone's name, notices when someone seems upset. The observation was delivered as simple fact, without the judgment that might once have accompanied any comparison of Wilson traits with mine. Richard had come to see that the strengths I brought to the family were complementary, not threatening. That diversity of thought and approach made all of us stronger. They're lucky to have you teaching them, I said sincerely. Your knowledge of the craft, the industry, the family history, that's irreplaceable. Richard studied his grandson's sleeping face. And they're lucky to have you showing them how to question tradition, how to see beyond established patterns. I never gave my children that freedom. The admission hung in the evening air between us, not quite an apology, but a recognition of what might have been different. We all carry the weight of our choices, the awareness of paths not taken, but tonight was about celebration, not regret. Well, Richard said, straightening his shoulders, the anniversary collection launch is just 2 months away? I think we should consider adding that rocker design you proposed, the one with the modified armrests. The ergonomics are superior to our traditional model. I smiled at this return to business, Richard's comfort zone, the place where our relationship had first found its footing. I'll have the design team prepare prototypes next week. As Richard carried James inside, Daniel joined me at the balustrade, slipping an arm around my waist. Everything okay? Everything's good, I assured him. Your father was just sharing some observations about the twins. Daniel watched his father disappear into the house, my sleeping son secure in his arms. If anyone had told me 5 years ago that we'd be here, Dad willingly praising your influence on the company, Mom hosting family gatherings where you're treated as an equal, the business thriving beyond our most ambitious projections, I wouldn't have believed it possible. The human capacity for change is remarkable, I observed, when the alternative becomes untenable. Is that what happened? Dad changed because he had no choice? I considered the question carefully. I think he changed because he saw evidence he couldn't dismiss. The company's success under new leadership, the twins' obvious trust and love for me. Your standing with me instead of automatically siding with him. Reality became more compelling than his preconceptions. Daniel nodded slowly. And what about us? How did we change? We learned to be honest, with ourselves and each other, I replied. No more convenient fictions about who we are or what we need. No more accepting disrespect to keep the peace. He pulled me closer as the evening breeze carried the scent of Patricia's carefully tended roses. I'm sorry it took such a dramatic confrontation to get us here. I'm not, I said thoughtfully. That Thanksgiving dinner when your uncle called me worthless, as painful as it was, forced everything into the open. No more pretending, no more compromise of my essential worth. Sometimes you need that moment of perfect clarity to find your voice. Inside the house, I could see Sophia now, twirling in the center of the living room, demonstrating some new dance move for her attentive grandmother. Patricia clapped with genuine delight, her perfect composure relaxed in the presence of her granddaughter's uninhibited joy. 5 years had transformed what it meant to be part of the Wilson family. The hierarchy had flattened, the definition of contribution had expanded, and the word worthless had been permanently banished from our collective vocabulary. Every member of the family, by birth or by marriage, brought their unique gifts to our shared table. As we prepared to rejoin the celebration, I reflected on the strange alchemy that had turned a moment of deep humiliation into the catalyst for profound change. Sometimes the most valuable revelations come disguised as insults. Sometimes our greatest strength emerges from moments when others underestimate us most severely. And sometimes, the family that dismisses you is the very one you're meant to transform. Not through vengeance or retribution, but through the simple, persistent demonstration of your undeniable worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.